Hello and welcome to Armenian News Network Groong. I'm 𝐓𝐡𝐸𝐿. It has now been 7 days since Azerbaijan initiated a wide-scale attack against Armenia and Artsakh. The tragic news of deaths and destruction continue to stream in every hour. In today's conversation on Groong, we talk to Jirair Libaridian and Thomas DeWaal about the regional geopolitics that helped create a ripe environment for renewed fighting, and various potential scenarios that may develop as a result of it. To help guide this conversation, we have 𝐬𝐡𝐸𝐿, who is a senior lecturer of political science and international relations at Bentley University in Massachusetts, where he teaches courses on Middle East and former Soviet space. Before we begin, however, we appreciate your help in reaching a wider audience, so please hit the pause button and make sure to subscribe and like us on whatever platform you listen to us on, and help spread the word by sharing this podcast on your social media channels. Thanks in advance.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Just 2.5 months ago, in July 2020, we witnessed border skirmishes between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Last Sunday, the conflict between the two countries escalated into what all observers agree to be the deadliest round of hostilities since the 1994 ceasefire. Since that year, the uneasy no war, no peace state between the two countries around the future state of Nagorno-Karabakh is no more. There's been a deluge of coverage around the war itself in recent days. The weaponry, the tactics, casualty lists, and ongoing outcomes. We wanted to step back from the day-to-day of this conflict and examine the meta-alignments in the region. To do that, we are joined today with Professor Jirair Libaridian, who is the former director of the Armenian Studies program at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he also held the Alex Manukyan Chair of Modern Armenian History until 2012. However, more relevant to today's discussion, his experience from 1991 to 1997, he served as an advisor and then a senior advisor to Armenia's first president, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, and was the chief negotiator on Karabakh. He is the author of numerous books and articles on modern and contemporary Armenia. We're also joined today with Tom DeWaal, who is a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe, specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region. He's also the author of numerous publications about the region, the most relevant to the current developments being Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace and War. Welcome, gentlemen. One major outcome of the July skirmishes has been the activation of the Turkish foreign policy in the direction of Armenia and the South Caucasus. Regardless of any statements by anyone, Turkey has been de facto a party in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict today. Meanwhile, and oddly, Russia has been rather slow in reacting and pointing to its red lines in the region. Jirair, you were Levon Ter-Petrosyan's senior advisor during his tenure, and you were also the chief negotiator on Nagorno-Karabakh with many meetings in that context with Ankara, Moscow, Iran, as well as within the OSCE context. Could you please briefly tell us what are the meta-politics that form the hotbed that nurtures the Karabakh conflict, percolates it with periodic eruptions, let the steam out, and then the cycle continues? After that short introduction, if you can also provide a context, within this context, also give us your assessment of the trajectory in the past 6 months that led to this round of the war.
Thank you, 𝐬𝐡𝐸𝐿. It's kind of difficult to move away from the day-to-day, but I guess some of us have to do that, and it also occurs naturally when you think of the following statement: we should not have gotten to this point. We did not need to get to this point. I think the overall two comments regarding the larger issues. One is the Cold War was never over in general, but certainly a mini Cold War continued in this region. And secondly, what President George Bush, Papa Bush, imagined as the New World Order was never constituted. And whatever was a positive outcome of the international cooperation beginning in January 1991 regarding the first Iraq war in connection with the occupation of Kuwait, that goodwill, for different reasons, dissipated, and various rivalries continued. Consequently, that these two issues, that is, the continuation of the mini Cold War and the absence of an international order on which major powers agree, that has dissipated, and it makes possible what might have been very difficult or impossible in the past. The absence of the United States the absence of a strong European voice, the absence of UN or even NATO means that the second-rate powers like Turkey will try to benefit, even first-rate ones like China. This is a good time, it seems, for many to do things they would not have done otherwise. And of course, the weaknesses of the present American administration and the ambitious ambitions of others, the rise of dictators, all of that means that there are certain things possible today that would not have been possible in the past.
Right.
The second trajectory is, I think, some general comments. First is that we have a situation that indicates that the two sides gave up on each other at some point. The best hope of a revived positive movement toward peace was in 2018 after Pashinyan came to power and the Dushanbe Agreement happened. That is the consolidation of the ceasefire. I think where we are now is largely the result of both sides giving up on Dushanbe. That is, each had different expectations. Aliyev thought that by agreeing to these new arrangements regarding the consolidation of the ceasefire, he was giving time to Pashinyan to settle down and to start serious negotiations. Aliyev thought that Pashinyan is a Yerevansi or Ichevansi, he's not Garapakhsi. I'm not sure exactly what the discussions were at the time, but it is obvious, and I'm quite sure from other sources that what he expected was a better negotiating environment with Pashinyan. Pashinyan thought that he was gaining time because he thought that he was getting time in order to make Armenia better, stronger, more democratic, more prepared, economically better, and he thought he had the time. And that did not happen. And then we've had the escalation, the small test in July, and the escalation of the war of words, and each side taking an opposite direction. So each side justified the other's fears and suspicions, and each side heard from the other side what they wanted to hear in order to justify war. So I think these would be my initial comments.
Thank you, Jirair. Tom, I want to bring you into the discussion and your thoughts about this, but with a specific caveat. Jirair mentioned about Baku's expectations from the new government, and they're sort of waiting to see if the negotiations will be reset or it will take a new dimension and so on. From your experience, and you've done extensive research and continue to write about conflicts in Eastern Europe, but also in the Caucasus, Chechnya, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and so on. So what are your thoughts about what is the thinking and what are the planning or expectation going on in Baku and Yerevan behind the scenes? Were there indicators from what you've been following of such an escalation to take place? And as I mentioned earlier, do you think that Baku was fed up or their patience was too short to wait for more than 2 years to see if negotiations would be, I wouldn't call it back on track, but some kind of a track?
Thanks, Azbed, and I'm glad to be with you too, Jirair, at this very difficult moment. Yeah, there's definitely short-term reasons for what's happened, and Jirair has also mentioned some of them. The absence of the US, maybe the US election was even a factor here. Obviously, some guarantees from Turkey that Turkey would suddenly give much more active support to Azerbaijan, and then this disappointment with Pashinyan. Those are all obviously short-term factors for what we're seeing in the last few days. And then there are longer-term factors. Just this kind of build-up of, I guess, frustration on the Azerbaijani side. And, I've been, God help me, spending quite a bit of time on social media the last few days.
Like most of us.
Yeah, and both sides are expressing legitimate grievances, but of course they are legitimate grievances that talk past each other and can only be resolved together. The Armenian grievance is that the Azerbaijan has basically never sent any message to the Karabakh Armenians, but that we will ignore you or we will destroy you. That's basically the Armenian grievance, and this is where the phrase existential threat comes up. That basically, and this obviously the Turkish element obviously only enormously redoubles that. That's the Armenian narrative, which is it's a valid narrative, but there's also an Azerbaijani narrative that for 25 years, not just Karabakh, where a small number of Azerbaijanis lived, but also the territories around it, where around 500,000 people lived, the Armenians have not made any serious offer about returning these territories where all these people lived, and indeed they've over the years successively stopped calling them occupied territories or a buffer zone and started calling them liberated territories. And that's the Azerbaijani grievance about why would any country put up with this? And obviously both these grievances are legitimate and they can only be resolved together. And this is, I guess, where the international failing comes in that the Minsk group, who should have been trying to negotiate more seriously, have been a bit absent without leave. It's defaulted to the Russians, who've got their own agenda. I mean, you have to give credit to Sergei Lavrov. He's actually been working this issue, but the Americans and the French certainly haven't been the last few years. And so the parties to the conflict say they're not doing anything for us. And there's this kind of mutual contempt, maybe a too strong a word, mutual disappointment, that the international look and say, well, these guys aren't serious about making peace, and the regional actors say these guys aren't serious about helping us, and that's basically where you end up with a mess like we've got today.
And Tom, as a follow-up, do you think that the frustration that exists on the Azerbaijani side in any way is influencing Aliyev's position, domestically speaking?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is obviously a factor that we've seen before, is that the opposition, so-called opposition, is often more Catholic than the Pope, as they say, more patriotic on this issue. And certainly you see no difference in message between different Azerbaijanis. You know, Khadija Ismail, a person I hugely respect for her struggle for human rights, posting extremely patriotic messages, Ilgar Mammadov, and so on and so on. And we all know that this is the one issue that unites both nations, as it were, that everyone rallies around the flag. But of course, this is where it gets dangerous. If there's no perception of success, if Aliyev cannot declare some kind of success, then the only option is to start sending in young men, sending in the conscripts to fight. And this is when suddenly it becomes less about rallying around the flag and about families losing their loved ones.
Jirair, both you and Tom actually have had extensive interactions with people in Azerbaijan, in Turkey, for your work, through your especially Jirair with your diplomatic work, but also academic work afterwards. Do you have any other perceptions or any other sort of views to add about the perception from Baku on the issue of the negotiations or the impasse when it comes from their perspective, and also from Yerevan's perspective about the impasse?
The Armenian side often ignores the grievances of the other side, and it's mutual, of course. That is, we often do not take responsibility for the consequences of what we say. And from Baku's point of view, when Prime Minister Pashinyan declares that Karabakh is Armenia, period, and leaders say negotiations are useless, and then they bring up the Aliyev factor as a dictator who does not speak for Azerbaijanis, that is our assessments of the other side and our position itself. We consider it justified, and that's the end of it. We do not consider what it means to the other side. We think the Armenian side thinks that the Azerbaijani position is extremist. There's no concession there. Well, the Azerbaijanis don't see much concession on the Armenian side. There are three issues interrelated. Status of Karabakh, the territories under Armenian control that were not populated by Armenians, that is the occupied territories that, as Tom said, now called liberated. And third, security, and security is also related to the first two. And on the status issue, Azerbaijan says, I will look at anything as long as it's within the jurisdiction of Azerbaijan. Armenians say, we're not going back to the former, and we want independence, and being under Azerbaijan under any circumstances is impossible. So these are both, in a way, extreme positions. The territories, no one in Armenia is talking about them nowadays, and it's been some time. And then security becomes irrelevant if these two are not resolved. So I would think that on the Armenian side, we say they're not serious in negotiating, whatever they're proposing, and we often go by public statements. Unfortunately, I have to say that I do not think there have been very serious in-depth discussions between the two sides in the last 2-3 years. I think Serge Sargsyan got into it, but I don't think that the Armenian side sat seriously to discuss some elements of a possible settlement in substance. The Armenian side raised technical issues, participation of Karabakh. Prime Minister Pashinyan had a formula about any solution being accepted by all three peoples, all of which may sound good, but I'm not sure that they deal with the substance of the issue. And for Azerbaijan, one thing was clear, it has been clear for some time. The ceasefire is perpetuating a status quo that is not acceptable. And for the Armenian side, the general belief is that we still have time, and if it means war once in a while, it's okay. We can go to war and we will win. So the logic of discussions does not include the other's issues on either side. The logic of the discussion in each country is within itself. So each side is negotiating with itself, not with the other, actually. So this is this, I think, is a serious problem in terms of perceptions.
Zooming out from Baku and Yerevan and trying to look at the larger regional dynamics, we were having this discussion earlier, Tom, about the unprecedented role that Turkey has been playing in this conflict. And both of you, please do correct me, especially Jirair, because you're a historian, whether or not there has been this kind of an involvement of Turkey in the Karabakh conflict or not. But let me ask the question first to Tom. What do you think what could explain Turkey's involvement at this level in the conflict now? Why now? Is it a factor of Erdogan factor, or there are other geopolitical gains or processes that influence that?
Well, I think Erdogan, in a world of disruptors, wants to be yet another disruptor in the Middle East and now in the Caucasus as well. He sees room for that the kind of multilateral organizations that might have pushed, and the kind of US-European axis that might have pushed back against that 5, 10 years, 20 years ago isn't there, whether it be in the Middle East or now in the Caucasus. So he sees a chance to be the kind of the tough neighborhood kid who can throw his weight around and can do his friend a favor and win some favors in the Muslim world and in the Turkic world. I think he thinks this is relatively low cost because he's not actually sending any boots on the ground. He's just assisting with drones and things like that. But of course, it's dangerous, and suddenly he knows that this could end up with a confrontation with Russia, which he doesn't want, which is one danger. France has reacted particularly sharply, which may not be helpful. But I think this is kind of Erdogan's modus operandi to throw his weight around and see where things land and enjoy the chaos. But I'm not sure that he's planning particularly ahead. I mean, clearly one agenda is to try and, as it were, break the Minsk group. And both Azerbaijan and Turkey want to break the Minsk group and have an expanded format in which Turkey has a seat at the table. Is that going to work? How's Russia going to react? It's all going to be extremely messy, but this is obviously the agenda in Turkey.
Right. Other than being the destructor in chief in Turkey, Erdogan's policy, would you agree with the argument that the engagement in Nagorno-Karabakh or on the Azerbaijani side is a low risk, high return, could be a low risk, high return victory for Erdogan?
Yeah, I think that's how Erdogan sees it. I think he's an Istanbul street kid at heart. I think he sees politics in even more a crude fashion, perhaps than Putin does. I think and he's probably quite enjoying the way the Russians have been caught off balance here and don't really know how to react. So I think that is his game, which isn't to say that the Russians and the Europeans and others haven't got things that they can do in return, but certainly in the short term, it's working.
Jirair, you've spent a lot of time as a negotiator interacting with Turkish diplomacy, diplomatic machine, and institutions, and you know it very well with the people you interacted, at least back in the 90s and early 2000s. What's your assessment of Turkish involvement now at this point, at this level, with this intensity?
Well, let me first explain my understanding of the term extreme, which I used for both cases, extreme demands. That is, the demand by Azerbaijan that Karabakh Armenians submit to Azerbaijan is, I consider, extreme because it is almost impossible at this point, if not altogether impossible. And similarly, for the Armenians to expect that Azerbaijan will recognize the independence of Karabakh is also extreme because it is impossible at this point. So this is, that is, if you're serious about negotiations, then you have to realize what is not, what cannot be attained at this point. And if you demand the impossible, then you're blocking negotiations. Now, with regard to Erdogan, I think, of course, I agree fully with Tom's explanation of what Erdogan as a person is, but I would add one, as far as Erdogan is concerned, the idea that seems to have grown on him, or that is being revealed more clearly, his Ottomanism, his dislike of the Republican system, not just from religious point of view, but in general as a form of government. So being involved in Iraq, Syria, and then trying Lebanon, Libya, these are Ottoman territories, formerly, historically. Now, the Ottoman model is also important, not just because it may be relevant to understanding Erdogan's policies, but also because it is part of the paradigm that was created before the First World War, before the genocide. That is, Armenians trying to reform the Ottoman state so that they could breathe within it and their people could be comfortable, and Ottomans looking at Armenians getting support from Europe as a way of dismembering Turkey. So this is a paradigm that is known as the Sevr syndrome, right? The Armenians became the enemy for a number of reasons. They were considered the enemy to the Young Turks for a number of reasons. But the paradigm itself is quite simple. That is, you guys want to change the government to something where the Turkish dominance will decrease and maybe disappear. And you are trying to dismember us by appealing to the Europeans. The reason for the appeal doesn't matter, except the impact is European powers, great powers, used the Armenians in order to get things for themselves. Now, this paradigm, the Sevr syndrome, known as the Sevr syndrome since then, was revived very quickly. I mean, it has been revived for some time when political parties in the diaspora in Armenia have called for the return of Western Armenia or the Eastern Ottoman Turkish provinces. Now, I do think that this logic became more dominant in the minds of Turkish leaders. And this is where all Turkish parties agree. When discussion about Sevr Treaty increased and reached the level of the government. The president and the prime minister talked about the 100th during the 100th anniversary Congress and celebrations or whatever. They revived the SERV Treaty as a state policy. That is, the SERV Treaty is something that is desirable. And now imagine that Erdogan dislikes not only the SERV Treaty, but he dislikes the Lausanne Treaty too. He's that far off. So we have a leader in Turkey who is so far away from what Armenians are thinking, but Armenia, and of course this is united, the three political parties joined in to make a statement that this is it, the SERV Treaty. The president of Armenia, although almost powerless, but he's still the president, saying that this is the answer to the Armenian question. So even the term itself was the Armenian question, that is pre-World War I language. So I think we have fallen into, as far as Turkey is concerned, the third element is that they have considered, obviously, Azerbaijan the closest of the Turkic peoples, and like their younger brothers. I remember during negotiations in the Minsk Group, when the Minsk Group was 11 countries, and there's Azerbaijan, newly independent, and Turkey with a lot of experience and experienced diplomats, they were trying to teach Azerbaijanis on how to behave. And there was one session when Azerbaijan agreed to something I had said, and the Turkish representative got up and screamed in Turkish, "𝐂𝐸𝐺𝐢𝐚-𝐬 what are you talking about? You don't know what you're giving away." But soon after that disappeared. The Azerbaijanis became good diplomats themselves. The point is that there has been an increased identification of Turkey officially and popular level with the cause of Azerbaijan. And it's not just the Azeri minor group, Azeri ethnic lobbying in Turkey. There has been an increasing, and that started changing when toward the full identification, when Azerbaijan joined in the denial of the genocide, right? So Azerbaijan gave something to Turkey, and subsequently we started behaving as if they were the same. The Garapaxis always called Azeris as Turks, but the policy-wise, and eventually for Turkey, Azerbaijani losses became their own losses. And this became a question of honor for Turkey and for Azerbaijan, for Turkey and the Turkish people and political parties. A question of honor, and saying, you guys have beaten our brothers enough, 93, 94, 2016, July of this year, but that's enough. Now we're going to help them. And this the full identification is a very important factor. And that's why I'm concerned that I believe Erdogan and Çavuşoğlu when they say we're not leaving until, because if they lose, if Azerbaijan loses, that means Turkey has lost. So the logic of the situation leads me to think that they will stay and maybe create a front in Nakhchivan and other. I think this is much more dangerous if the logic of the conflict and this identification of Turkey, not just alliance and closeness and kinship, but total identification. I think this is the most dangerous thing. Let me add one more thing with regard to Russia. I think I would go a step further than Tom did in terms of Turkey and Russia. Whether consciously or unconsciously, I think they are repeating a scenario. I would think that if Russia was an ally of Armenia, which it is formally, not only bilaterally, but also through the Common Defense Treaty, that Russia would have said something more serious, if not done something about the Turkish involvement directly now in the conflict and downing of an Armenian plane. That hasn't happened. My suspicion is that there is something going on as it did in 1920-21. That is, Russia wants to impose a solution, and doing so kind of consolidate its presence and expand it to Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus. But Russia does not want to impose a solution in a manner that Armenian government, political parties, and the people will become anti-Russian. Turkish pressure and participation and the fear of Turkey and any losses Armenia may sustain may lead Armenia to go to Moscow for help, and Moscow then will impose its conditions, and then there will have been some kind of a Russian-Turkish tandem. We talk about Azerbaijan-Turkey, but what concerns me as much, if not more, is the Russia-Turkey situation, and it's not too far-fetched, I think, that there may be some kind of understanding. If you remember, before the war started, a couple of weeks before, there was a lengthy discussion between Erdogan and Putin. And what did they discuss, I wonder? Anyway, that's about...
Tom, I want to come back to you with this question that you already raised earlier when you were talking about Russia, that they were caught off guard and their silence was instigated or motivated by being sort of unprepared for this. And we just heard Jirair, who provided an alternative perspective that actually they might have been aware. There might have been also, to a large extent, I don't want to call it encourage, but they are okay with such a Turkish involvement in their backyard. What are your thoughts about Moscow's involvement?
I don't share that view. I mean, I've always held a slightly unpopular view that Russia's influence is exaggerated here, that Russia's always tried to sort of manipulate, balance, to pivot in between one actor and the other in this conflict, and that it's a bit of a shadow influence. It looms large, but it's actually not very real. And now, and Russia hasn't got boots on the ground. Compare this with a century ago, 1920, the Bolshevik 11th Army rampaging through Baku and Karabakh and Armenia. That's real Russian influence. They've got one base in Armenia. They've withdrawn from Azerbaijan. Both sides managed to stop them being peacekeepers back in 1994. So if the parties really want to do something, then they can defy the Russians, and obviously this is basically one party, Azerbaijan. So I think sure, the Armenians can come to the Russians and say, we want more of your support, but I think the Azerbaijanis, can live without Russia, and this is they're energy free of Russia. I think Russia's leverage on Azerbaijan is actually quite weak, and I think this is the Russian problem. This kind of pivoting, balancing act that they've performed is suddenly being disrupted by Azerbaijan. And sure, they've got one or two things they're going to try, but I think they've been caught off balance. I think Putin himself hides from this conflict. He's never taken it seriously. Interestingly, in the 4-year presidency of Medvedev actually tried to take this conflict seriously. But I think I've read pretty much everything that Putin has ever said on this conflict. He's either kind of made some bad taste jokes about it. He's talked about Agdam wine, or he said it's not our conflict. We're not going to deal with it. He prefers bilateral relations with Baku and Yerevan, and he's tried to avoid this conflict, and I think he's paying the price in Russian influence today. I know it's not the orthodox view of the Russian role in this conflict, but let's see. I think Russia's definitely been caught off guard here.
Tom, you did mention about the historically back in 1920 when the Russians had boots on the ground, and they don't have it now. Sergei Lavrov yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, when he made a statement about possible settlement of the conflict, at least in the translation, English translation, he said, independently as well as within the OSCE Minsk group. Don't you think that this might be Russia's in to put boots on the ground, somehow either as peacekeepers or just waiting to see until probably Armenia or even Azerbaijan might turn to Russia to say, okay, okay, we'll listen to you?
I'm sure this is the Russian agenda to solve the conflict with and have a kind of peace settlement with a kind of Russian flavor to it, involving opening up communication routes, Russian boots on the ground. But I would remind you that back in 1994, and Jirair knows this better than I do, when Russia had much more influence in the region, it had had bases across the region. The two nations were much weaker. The ceasefire had a two-phase agenda. One was a Russian ceasefire, the second was a Russian peacekeeping force. And when the defense ministers came to Moscow, they basically said no to Pavel Grachov, the Russian defense minister. The Azerbaijanis said no. And if you believe Armenian sources, the Armenians were very happy for the Azerbaijanis to say no because they didn't want Russian peacekeepers either.
Moving along, I know, Tom, your time is limited. I want to also bring in the issue of Iran, which has relatively been sidelined, at least other than making some major statements about cautioning both sides and so on and so forth. Before asking about Iran, but I also want you to look at or think about or comment about the perception, at least by some analysts, that Turkey and Russia are trying to move the framework of Nagorno-Karabakh from a Euro-Atlantic, from Western Minsk group framework to a more regional one. So within that context, do you think that Iran has any role to play, constructive role to play? And what do you make of Iran's relative silence on this issue?
My answer will be quite simple because I'm not an Iran guy, but Iran has always been, since Iran was, as we know, trying to mediate talks in May of 1992 when Shusha was taken by the Armenian forces, and since that humiliation, they've never had a role, and the Western powers have been happy to keep them out. My view is that if there is to be some kind of new format, it should be a wider format. If there should be some kind of Minsk conference, not in Minsk, which I guess is not the best place at the moment to hold a conference, but there should be some conference. Why not hold it in Venice or somewhere more pleasant? And that conference, should be, the Georgians should be there, and the Iranians should be there, and the Chinese should be there. And there should be a lot of people there who haven't had a formal role up till now in the negotiations. But on the details, I think I'm going to have to default to Jirair.
On the issue of Iran, but putting aside the issue of Iran, the second part or the argument that do you see or do you feel that there is a tendency to move away from Minsk and considering it with the role of the US, the Euro-Atlantic sort of framework, into a more regional one? Would Turkey and Russia be interested in such a framework, such a formula?
If you're asking me, I think you can't immediately dismantle a diplomatic framework like that. The OSCE has this framework. I do think there is a certain logic to, the OSCE is also in a leadership crisis at the moment. There is a certain logic to move it to the UN, but that has to be done in a systematic fashion. You don't just break up a 30-year-old diplomatic process at the drop of a hat. But certainly, and I think the Americans, I think both sides would have reasons to want the Americans and the French in there and other Europeans. But I think we are definitely seeing the slow death of the Minsk process and its replacement by something else, which I hope is going to be more efficacious rather than less.
Yeah, on ceremonial passing away of the OSCE, of the Minsk process. Jirair, what about your thoughts? I mean, again, in your capacity as a diplomat, you have met with Iranian leaders, Iranian diplomats, and you know their views in terms of the regional conflict, which could easily spill over to Iran, especially with their Azeri population, ethnic Azeri population. Where do you see, or do you see any role of Iran now in what's happening, based on their statements or actions even?
Sorry, I think I'm going to have to step out here. I've got a couple of calls I need to make.
Take care, Tom.
Iran's position is very interesting. I personally think it would be extremely helpful because I find Iranian diplomacy to be very effective, number one. Number two, very eager and I think it would be very useful. But this is one point on which everyone else agrees. The Russians don't want the Iranian involvement. The Turks don't want it. The Americans don't want it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Europeans might want it. In fact, it is possible that the Minsk group was created in order to ensure the failure of the Iranian diplomacy and efforts. So
Right.
it is very possible that it was done by the Russians. It was whatever. Now, because of the day of the occupation of Shushi, of the liberation of Shushi in May. Now, and they were involved for 9 months, by the way. And this, I can say that their involvement was out of self-interest on two levels. First, they don't want two neighbors to fight. And second, what you mentioned, the large Azeri minority in the north of Iran that was restive and which 𝐂𝐶𝐵 was trying to provoke. And their solution to that was to tell their Azeri citizens, look, we're trying to make peace with these, don't make life more difficult for us. So their initiative to establish a ceasefire and then move on to possibly a solution was also in that respect out of self-interest. But if I may, I want to, I'm sorry that Tom left, but I want to continue that discussion on the role of Russia. My view is that Tom is right in saying not much influence on Azerbaijan. But Russia doesn't need to influence Azerbaijan. Russia needs to make Azerbaijan more of an ally, a closer beholden to them. And what it needs to do is what they've always advocated, to have a solution that is to the detriment to the Armenian position. And if they do that, then Azerbaijan will be friendly. And they do have serious influence on Armenia, from arms to infrastructures. So I think they also have some influence on internal processes. So it is, I think the Russian influence is being more significant in Armenia. That is where they need to make the difference. So that's number one. Number two, I don't think Russian policy, as unified as it is just Putin. I don't think we could underestimate foreign policy people. Lavrov, of course, is in charge, but there's a strong foreign ministry there that has defined interests. And certainly the army, the armed forces of Russia, they have their own powerful intelligence and they conduct their own thinking. And I think Russian policy is a reflection of that. In the 1990s, under Yeltsin, you could see the difference between these three. I remember one week when an advisor of Yeltsin came to convey to us Russian policy, then the foreign ministry ambassador came to talk about Russian policy, and I know that GRU, the military intelligence, was talking to our people in defense and saying this is our policy. You know, that was unified later, but still it just, I think we need to think of people other than Putin also participating in the making. And the disinterest of Putin may be real, but still doesn't mean that others are not pushing for things.
And Jirair, sorry to interrupt, but do you feel that within the context of Russian multiple voices, there is also a clear directive or a clear trajectory to remove the negotiations from OSCE to a more regional context?
Well, two comments on that. Number one, I think the Minsk Group process has now been reduced to almost nothing. Statements, Zimbabwe can make statements, Chile can make statements on end the conflict, please. I think the direction of things has been more toward Russia. And we have to realize one thing. It is a paradoxical truth, I think. On this issue, as to what should the solution entail to the conflict of Karabakh, Europe, US, and Russia agree. And they agree on behalf of Azerbaijan. That is, they agree that Karabakh should not be independent. They agree that the territories should be returned. Under what circumstances, with what guarantees, is something else. So once we realize that, then it does not matter who is in the Minsk group. The US has not acted independently. The only thing that is different is once that is agreed or imposed on the parties, that solution, who will benefit from the peace? Who will benefit as the maker of peace? So, and I think while they are functioning together, when in other areas they fight each other, right? The US and Russia, on this they haven't, because they agree in the principles, but nothing has been done more than words, because they're not sure that if I put pressure on my client, he will not go to the other. This is called the forum shopping that used to happen a lot. So I think that it is almost an irrelevant question. There's no doubt that if Russia takes the initiative, the others will back Russia. But the reality now is that Turkey is involved more directly, declared itself party to the conflict, is fighting now. This without boots, but it is fighting on the side of Azerbaijan like it has never done before. And it means also that they will insist on being part of the negotiations, whatever the result of this fighting. They will not go away. And it is Russia and Turkey are the two countries that are, other than Iran, the most directly interested in this, the most directly involved, and the most directly trying to have their influence and have the resolution the way they want it. So I think the formula will be Russia and Turkey, and with or without Azerbaijan and Armenia. With or without. They don't have to. If they agree, then Turkey will put the military pressure, Russia will benefit, and Azerbaijan will not lose anything. There will not be anything that is harmful to Azerbaijan. There will be parts of that solution that are harmful to the Armenians, including evacuation from the at least most of the districts under some circumstances.
Thank you, Jirair. And on this sober and perhaps somber sort of analysis and view of this larger perspective, I hope we've been able to provide a context to keep analyzing this issue. We'll be covering more on this issue in our Weekend Review, Groong's Weekend Review podcast, and possibly the next days and weeks by having more experts and expert analysis on this issue.
And that concludes our program for this episode of Groong Weekend Review. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from this previous week. We look forward to your feedback and suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at groong.org, that's Groong, and on our Facebook page, ANN-Groong, or in our Facebook group, Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. I'm 𝐓𝐡𝐸 𝐺, and on behalf of everyone in this episode, I wish you a good week. Thank you for listening, and talk to you next week.